President Cyril Ramaphosa is expected to issue a proclamation on the election day today. Once the date is gazetted, the voters' roll will be closed and the Electoral Commission will then start reviewing candidates' names from political parties and independents. Let's now have this discussion and further discussion with the Executive Director from Defend Our Democracy, Zaakirah Vadi. Zaakirah, good morning. Thank you so much for making time for us this morning.
Good morning. Thank you very much for having me on air.
So what happens once the President has signed the proclamation?
Once the President signs the proclamation, no one can then register to vote. So voters basically have just today to register, and they can go online to do so or to the nearest IEC regional center and try and register to vote. So that's the first thing that will happen. And thereafter, the IEC will work out the electoral timetable, and that will be made public. So those are the two things that we can expect after the President signs the proclamation.
Yeah. So once the President signs the proclamation, does it mean that the voters' roll closes immediately, or will there be some sort of lapse at least? Because we've been reporting about that, and the IEC has also said that eligible voters would have up until midnight to register to vote. So does it mean that we expect the President to sign just before midnight, or if he does sign way before midnight, will there still be that lull to allow eligible voters to go and register?
I think it's once the proclamation is then published. As you mentioned the word gazetted earlier. And I think that's why the leeway is today to get the final batch of people who are interested in registering to vote to do so. I think as civil society organizations, our call has always been to people who are eligible to vote, particularly new voters, young voters who are not yet on the voters' roll, to make sure they do so today. So I think that this period today is really trying to get that last batch who are interested to register to do so.
Yeah. So we already know that we have a voters' roll that is higher than ever, so it's a record high voters' roll. But on the other end as well, the IEC has also been blamed for failing to communicate to eligible voters that actually you can still go register to vote, even if it doesn't fall during the voter registration weekend. So any other day, you can still go out to register to vote. What do you make of that assessment?
So there's two things here. One is that there's always a misconception that you have to physically go to the voting stations on the 2 days set aside for voter registration to do so. This year, there could have been perhaps a bit more done around online registration. We know that it was quite popular, but there's always room for improvement. Secondly, though, our assessment is that when people don't register to vote, it's less about general disinterest in democracy, but almost a way of disengaging from the democratic process, because people feel that if they vote, what's going to change? Is it going to improve their lives? And that's really what's at play here. So people understand the importance of voting, but don't really see the impact that it may make on their lives, and are not understanding, I think, the long term in terms of the democratic processes.
Yeah. And with that said, then the responsibility of the political parties themselves to encourage people to register to vote and to get their names on the voters' roll, but also the point that you've just raised now, that some people would say that I've registered to vote. For instance, I've seen people that have gone out to register to vote. I've seen people voting, but their lives are not changing. And why should we be encouraging any other person to go out to register to vote?
So voting is the first part of that democratic process. It's the first part of exercising your right and making a choice. And in this year's election, we know it's going to be one of the most closely contested, both at a provincial level and at a national level. And when people say every vote does count, particularly for 2024, every vote will count. That's the first thing. The second thing is that we shouldn't see voting as the end. It's really the start of the democratic process. So thereafter, there's a lot more that needs to follow in terms of public accountability over their public representatives, both in Parliament as well as the provincial legislature.
Speaking about the accountability of independent candidates, there has been an amendment to the Electoral Act that allows independent candidates to also contest the elections. But what we normally have is right now, for instance, with the party political system, is that the party will deploy somebody to, let's say, legislature, council, or the National Assembly. and the party has its own internal mechanisms to hold an MPL, a deployee, accountable. And sometimes those internal mechanisms fail. But what about the independent candidates? Who holds them accountable once they have been voted into the National Assembly? How can those who have voted them into the National Assembly hold them accountable outside of the 5-year election cycle?
So this is the first time we're trying out having independent candidates at the national and provincial level. We've had independent candidates at the local government level, and there it's easy to hold your independent candidate accountable because it's within your community and that's the constituency, and you're able to call that councillor, if they're an independent candidate, and say, hey, but you haven't delivered on X, Y, and Z. In the case of Parliament, it is going to be slightly more difficult. I think we do need to be looking at better measures, not just to hold independent candidates accountable, but all public representatives, so all parliamentarians. How do people access their parliamentarians directly and hold them accountable without that just having to be exercised via the political party? As you've indicated, via political parties, there's always room for political parties to put pressure on their own members, for example, to vote in a particular way, to cover up certain things, for example, and do not hold the cabinet accountable. So there's always room there for, or gap perhaps, in public oversight.
Yeah. Zaakirah, the other one, of course, lots of news in these upcoming elections, and the other one is that we'll see people having 3 ballots instead of the 2 that we've been used to. Just explain that to us.
So because we have an amended electoral act and therefore a new system or slightly amended system for this year's election, you'll have 2 ballots at the national level. One will have all of the political parties on it listed, and your second ballot at the national level will have political parties and independent candidates that will be listed on it. And then you will have a third ballot, and that will be at the provincial level, and that will include both political parties and independent candidates on the list. So we still have quite a bit to do, I think, in terms of voter education, just for people to understand how the different ballots will look and how exactly they can best exercise their votes.
Yeah. And another difference this time around as well is that the IEC is saying that, well, before you could vote wherever you are in the province that you are registered at, you can go to any voting station to go and register, or to go and vote there, that this time around you must actually alert them which voting station you would be using if it's outside of the one that you're registered to vote at.
Yes, previously, with previous elections, for example, if I live in Gauteng and I find myself in Western Cape, I would still be able to vote in the Western Cape on the national ballot, not the provincial ballot. However, this time around, the IEC is saying that if you are going to be in a different province on election day, you would have to apply beforehand, and they will be publishing on the electoral timetable the date by which to apply for that to be made available to you. I think the best message that we can really give to people is that of the IEC, that wherever you are registered to vote, that's where you should go and vote. I think it also makes practical sense given that there are specific numbers of ballot papers that are given to voting stations. So it's not an unlimited supply per voting station. There's a specific number that's delivered, and that's the specific number that is then used, perhaps with a few extra ballot papers that are left over. So that's really, I think, the key of the voters this year.
Thank you so much for your time. That is Zaakirah Vadi, who's the Executive Director at Defend Our Democracy. So today, the final day for you to register to vote. If you are eligible to register to vote, remember that once the President signs the proclamation and it is gazetted, that means that the voting, that the voters' roll closes. So make sure that you go online to the IEC's website, and you can also go to the IEC's municipal offices to update your details as well.